Thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Gass, the Director of Pioneer Education. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. Welcome to our webinar, Civics 101. Historian Drew McCoy's biography, The Last of the Fathers, on the 1830s retirement years of James Madison, is a wonderful portrait of the father of the Constitution when he was into his mid-80s. A visitor observed, Madison's wasted body encased a mind still as bright and sun-like as ever. Never have I seen so much mind in so little matter. The elderly fourth president was always a voracious reader. It was his deep knowledge of history and commitment to Republican self-government that made him optimistic about the constitutional republic he did so much to help establish. But he was no Pollyanna either. Madison's study of ancient and modern republics and even the rowdy daily events of the Jacksonian democracy taught him enduring civic lessons that strengthened his Republican faith. That is, not even the excesses of Andrew Jackson's populism, the horrors of slavery, John C. Calhoun's nullification crisis, nor the American Indian Wars could shake his fundamental belief that a well-constructed republic could mediate popular political factions. These factions might shake the landscape of the young republic, but not Madison's enduring confidence in our Constitution. That's because the framers knew that their experiment in ordered liberty rested on a citizenry that was well educated in the basics of civics, government, and a respect for the rule of law. And it was in the 1830s that Horace Mann of Massachusetts first established common public schools to help perpetuate civic learning for liberty. In fact, it was civic education, not mere workforce development, that was the central reason public schools were created in the new republic. We need to remember the example of James Madison and Horace Mann as we confront political and cultural polarization that seems more divisive by the day. The recently released NAEP civic scores were another round of bad news about the impact of the COVID pandemic on school children. NAEP also reminded us of our now long-standing troubles teaching young people, not to mention elected public officials, the basics of our Constitution, form of government, and enduring civic ideals. We're watching these hard realities play out every day in the news, and it turns out that elementary civics isn't so elementary anymore. Nevertheless, the bad news shouldn't obscure good news that I've been very fortunate to observe for nearly 30 years now. My good news is this: the teachers and students who annually participate in the We the People, the Citizen, and the Constitution National Civics Contest have done a fantastic job for decades teaching and learning the civic education our country needs so much. But the program isn't just a competition. It includes an academically rigorous textbook and curriculum about the history and principles of our constitutional republic, as well as congressional-style hearings that keep students and teachers engaged. Since it began in 1987, over 30 million students and 75,000 educators have participated. The annual competition brings together about 1,200 students from across the country to answer civics questions based on America's founding documents, including the U.S. Constitution, the Federalist Papers, U.S. Supreme Court decisions, and much more. Many heroic We the People teachers and educators, several of whom are with us today, have kept K-12 civics and history alive in our classrooms. We the People is a model of civics education that citizens, parents, and policymakers need to know more about, support, and cherish. Like Madison, we owe it to young people to be optimistic while we work hard to educate them and the public about the realities of human nature, our shared civic past, and meaningful citizenship grounded in deliberation. This is the only rational path forward in a republic based on the consent of the people. Frankly, there is really no alternative. We need to educate ourselves, our fellow citizens, even our elected officials in the virtues of self-government, toleration, and respect for the U.S. Constitution. Because, as Cheryl Brown Henderson, whose father, the Reverend Oliver Brown, was the lead plaintiff on the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision, told a Pioneer audience several years ago, in our democracy, it is not us and them, it is only us. To that end, today, we are particularly happy to be working with these terrific teachers who are among the most talented civic educators in the country. With us this afternoon, we have Roger Desrosiers. retired social studies teacher at Millbury High School and president of the Massachusetts Center for Civic Education. Shane Klein, academic dean and teacher at Raleigh Charter High School in North Carolina. Natalie O'Brien, social studies department chair and teacher at North Smithfield High School in Rhode Island. And Sam Olmschneider, teacher at Maggie L. Walker Governor's School in Virginia. We're honored to begin with Roger Desrosiers discussing Civics 101.
Thank you, Jamie. We're now going to dip our toes into the water of civic education by looking at some of the most important aspects, if you will, of our historical and foundational understanding. Our organization, Mass Civics Civic Center for Civic Education, has a program we call the Citizen Lyceum. The Lyceum borrowed, of course, from Aristotle's adult education that he did when in Greece, where he would do various things to inform and educate the masses there. We use citizen so that we can talk about American government and do so with adults and students. We do so in a nonpartisan, non-political, and non-ideological way. Today we'll focus and do so in a manner, hopefully in 30 minutes, which is really a very short amount of time, but to focus on three essential principles of government that our framers and our founders wanted to talk about: constitutionalism, liberalism, and of course, republicanism. But one of the features I want to stress is, even though at the end of the Constitutional Convention, we have our Federalists supporting it, and we have the Anti-Federalists, that we named as being those opposed, these three aspects and principles are recognized by both sides, but we'll need to understand why that is true. So going forward, we have the 236th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution, which will be coming up in September 17th of this year. And then, of course, I like to encourage us to look at John Adams, who wrote in his thoughts on government, if you'll notice the date, way before, we started to form a government. But I like to look at what I think most of our framers and founders, thought very essential to a good government. And so I take the look at his words where he says, there is no good government but what is Republican, that the only valuable part of the British Constitution is so because the very different definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. And this focus, is essential for us to understand how important it is considering, the times that we are in. This notion of, empire of laws and not of men is quite important, and it was essential to our founders and our framers. Going forward, they also understood the views on human nature. Even though it was 1787, they all gave powerful understanding about what is human nature. Give all the power to the many, they will oppress the few. Give all the power to the few, they will oppress the many, said Alexander Hamilton. And Benjamin Franklin echoed, there are two passions which have a powerful influence on the affairs of men. These are ambition and avarice, the love of power and the love of money. From the nature of man, we may be sure that those who have power in their hands will always, when they can, increase it, says George Mason. Now, that was 236 years ago. Have things changed? And so now they were cognizant of that. Well, let's take a look first at one of the terms that we need to understand and that is quite important to the founders and should be important to us today. This notion of liberalism, this notion of what is the natural rights philosophy. Please note, the philosophers of the 17th and the 18th century were quite taken, with this new philosophy that they were discussing. John Locke became a favorite of our founders and the two treatises on government that were discussed. The state of nature was not unique to John Locke. Other philosophers, okay, talked about it as well. The state of nature was simply the absence of government. And yet there would be a law of nature, they said, that would govern as well. No one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. But human nature as it is, we know that that would be there. So what would be there to protect us from any harm to our life, our health, our liberty, our possession? And that's where, of course, these philosophers said that necessitated a government. Well, we go forward, okay, with how did that impact our framers? Well, Thomas Jefferson's second paragraph in the Declaration of Independence in 1776, okay, captures the essence, if you will. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Why? Because the ministers have been talking about this in their churches. The political people have been discussing this, that all men are created equal. They have been endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, those that cannot be taken away. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of the government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new governments. I know you've heard these words yet before, but all of these words put together are so essential to why this was an important essence and message that our founders felt were quite important. Unalienable rights, those rights that should not be taken away. These governments are established for the purpose of protecting those rights. And yet, where did they get that right? From the consent of the governed, from those who are going to be governed. That whenever such form becomes destructive, then they have the right to alter, to change that government. But not change it to create an anarchy, but no, they change it to institute new governments. Governments that are then going to be able to protect our unalienable rights. So in other words, come full circle to create new governments that are going to do what was not being done, okay, thus the reason for why they needed to alter it. So the Declaration of Independence in the second paragraph was quite essential. Well, we have our second principle, republicanism. So what form of government are we going to have? Well, in those days, we have thousands of people that are going to be represented. Very difficult, nonetheless, at that particular time. Today, we have millions of people that would need to be represented. So representative government, okay, was going to be an essential piece. What example was before our founders? Well, the Roman Republic was the one that they thought would be best to be representative. James Madison in Federalist Paper number 39 states, we may define a republic to be a government which derives all of its powers directly or indirectly from a great body of the people and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. Thus, in the Constitution, what do we see? The House of Representatives having terms of 2 years, the Senate of 6, the presidency of 4, and then a justice of our Supreme Court having good behavior, thus life terms. Next. So then we have, okay, a second part that we don't often stress enough, and that is another trait of the Roman Republic in which representative government, okay, was also going to imply that those who represent us must also look at civic virtue in their decision making. So in James Madison's Federalist number 41, he states that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power is necessary to the public good. In the next will be in case of an affirmative decision to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. So very important, okay, that the essential part of civic virtue must be reflected in the laws and in the policies, okay, that those who represent, okay, must do. Please, next. Now, John Patrick a civic educator from the University of Indiana, wrote a small pamphlet called Understanding Democracy, in which he talks about, okay, the importance of the common good. So he reflects, republicanism emphasizes the participation of citizens for the common good of the community. Further, he says, it stresses the public rights and obligations of citizens to cooperate in support of their community. Next, please. Notice, if you haven't already, this tension that can often exist between the two. Liberalism or individual right or self-interest can often be in tension with republicanism or the common good or civic virtue. They recognized this, they understood this. So what kinds of examples can you see, for example, in the present day where that tension can exist? I'll give one example, and I'm sure many of you can see several other examples where this exists. Okay, next. So for example, let's take the simple example of smoking. For years, as I was growing up, smoking occurred everywhere, in all kinds of public places and in many private places. Individuals, okay, simply had the right, they simply lit up, they smoked, okay, wherever they wished. In the 1990s, when secondhand smoke, okay, scientifically became as lethal as it was for those who smoked, all of a sudden things changed. And so decisions became different on the state level, on the federal level. Laws became passed or were passed in order to say simply, no, we can't endanger those who are not smoking. And so therefore, all of a sudden we have laws that were created in order to protect the common good. In other words, those who were simply smoking as an individual right were now curtailed from smoking, okay, that affected those who were not smoking. Next, please. Our third principle is constitutionalism, limitations on government, rule of law. So all of this became a very essential part, especially when you contrast this with how many of the founders, okay, felt like the British were often, okay, not being limited in what they could do. So limited government means that officials cannot act arbitrarily when they make and enforce laws. Government officials cannot simply do as they please. Secondly, the rule of law means that neither government officials nor common citizens are allowed to violate the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, or the laws enacted in accordance with it. Again, John Patrick's Understanding Government, page 28. So this continues. So again, let's think about what other limitations there are on government. We'll take a pause in the sense for you to reflect, but as I go forward, let's go to the next slide that talks about the forming of a new national government. Next, please. So the first Constitution, okay, we should understand that even though the declaration of war, if you will, through the Declaration of Independence, on July 2nd, okay, we celebrate on July 4th, but on July 12th, nearly 8 days later, okay, the Second Continental Congress agrees to form a national government. But this national government, okay, was going to be weak. It was intentionally weak. They did not want a strong national government. They wanted something that was not going to be in parallel to what they had with Britain. So they intentionally formed a confederation that would have a singular purpose, a purpose that would simply unite the 13 colonies from the point of view of defending themselves. If they were to win, they would have defending from other foreign countries, but also defending themselves, okay, from Indian or Native American attacks. Next, please. We have the United Nations, we have the OPEC countries, which are today's examples, okay, of what, okay, confederations are. Weak in and of itself, but supported by other countries, okay, but they, of course, do not need to follow all the directives of these organizations. So the first Constitution, its purpose, defend the states. Sovereignty is the states. They don't have to follow the directives. There was only one branch of government. Delegates were 2 to 7 per state. However, only 1 vote per state would be counted when they were to make the laws or policies. Making laws could be passed only if 9 of the states, okay, voted on it. Amendments, okay, had to be done with unanimity of all 13 states. It was extremely difficult, okay, to accomplish anything, considering the fact that at no time did all 13 states ever come to a Confederation Congress meeting. So it was extremely difficult for the Articles of Confederation. Of course, as it endured, several other problems came up: economic, others were political, others were military difficulties like the Shays Rebellion. And so eventually we get on to, okay, the need by some to form another constitution, which we do next. Second constitution is formed, okay, where it begins in May of 1787. It ends, as you know, in September of 1787. The purpose is outlined in the preamble with 6 different goals. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote for the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Okay, you know the rest, okay? The sovereignty is in the hands of the people, not the states. The branches of government are the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. 3 branches of government, similar to what most states at that time will have. The delegates, okay, are going to be in 2 houses of Congress. That one will be proportional, the other will be equal. The vote will be 1 per representative. Making of laws will be by majority vote in each house. And the amendments, okay, will be simply stated 3/4 of the states once they go through the process. Next, please. Now let's get back to this constitutionalism that we were talking about. What are the limits on government? So I'm going to start at the bottom on the left-hand side. Popular sovereignty is the most essential because this is novel. At that particular time in our history, in our world history, we are one of the countries, okay, that is going to essentially devote itself at this particular time to giving the people the right, okay, to vote in elections, for them to be able to determine. Agreed, we understand that the limits on who can vote, okay, will be determined by the various states. There will be trial by jury. This trial by jury, one that should be known by most people, is a check on the government. It's a limit on the government. The jury gets this chance to determine guilt or innocence, okay, on what the government does. Then let's go back to the top. The separation of powers, a separate check on the government. Each branch of government does its own thing, supposedly. It does, okay, each branch makes the laws, the legislature. The executive, okay, executes the laws. The judicial branch interprets the laws. And then we throw in an additional check on each of the branches, where one of the branches, or sometimes 2 of the branches, can check the power of one of the other branches. And these things can be done. For example, within the legislature, we have a check on each house. In other words, to pass a law, as you may know, the same law must come out of each house. So they may debate in the Senate and they may debate in the House. However, the same law must be provided, if they pass it, to the president. So if there's a different law that comes out, or a different bill that comes out of each house, they have to confer to present to the president a similar law, the same law, or the same bill. Then they present it to the president, who has veto power to check, okay, whether or not that law is there. So that is a very important piece. The independent judiciary is quite different than what the British had. The British, okay, judiciary was appointed by the king or the monarchy. Here, it would be independent. Once the justices, okay, would be nominated by the president, the Senate, okay, would determine, okay, yes or no on those nominations. But after that, the justices, okay, are going to be there for life on good behavior. Of course, there is a check on that, the impeachment process. Then we have additional limits through the writ of habeas corpus. Okay, you're arrested, but you must be charged. Due process of law. Okay, you need to be able to have a hearing, whether it's at the local level, state level, federal level. Amendment power. One can change the Constitution. That amendment power may be difficult to process, but it can be done changing the Constitution. Post signing of the Constitution, we have our Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. First 5 words: Congress shall make no law. Well, again, most Americans believe that the First Amendment really is about rights, but the Bill of Rights is a limitation on what is Congress cannot do. It's a limit on Congress. Judicial review, though mentioned at the Constitutional Convention, does not get until 1803 with the Marbury versus Madison case, does not get to be a check on the Congress and on the executive until that particular case in 1803. Through the amendment process, expansion of suffrage, to women, to Black men, to 18-year-olds, and more, is through the amendment process. Equal protection under the law through the 14th Amendment. So let's go back next. Let's go back to something I said earlier. Next, please. The ratification process takes place, from December 1787 with Delaware first to ratify. And then, of course, in July, Virginia, New York. The principles of government, again, are liberalism, republicanism, and constitutionalism. The points of disagreement are on the degree of what is liberalism, republicanism, and constitutionalism. Allow me to finish with an example of what I'm talking about. The next slide, please. In Federalist 51, Madison, is going to reflect on what the anti-federalists have been arguing. The Federalists, the anti-federalists, are constantly talking about, here we are, we have an issue that we need to be discussing that they're concerned about. And their biggest concern is the people have control over this government. They are the ones, that are supposed to have control. So at the end of this statement, one that very, very famous statement in Federalist 51, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. Madison acknowledges that. But experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. So Madison says, remember human nature. Look at the first sentence. Human nature is there. We understand that human nature is such, that even the people with whom we place the trust of our country in is such that it itself may not be dependable. So therefore, we need to have other precautions. Those precautions are necessary in order to assure that the abuses of government can be controlled. And so therefore, we have inserted these separations of power and these checks and balances that will hopefully be able to control these issues of abuses and also these concerns that we have about human nature. And of course, here we are in 2023. And now here we are looking at whether or not these auxiliary precautions that Madison has talked about can endure. So as we have dipped our toes into the water as we have looked at the tip of the iceberg about civic education. I hope that you can take a look and understand. We as Americans need to understand a little bit more about what are the major principles of our government that our framers and our founders were so diligent about when they formed a government based upon ideas, based upon principles of government and those values that are necessary, and not a government based upon the men who were leading us, but based upon the principles and values and institutions that guide us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger, so much. I just want to tell the audience how grateful I am for all the really terrific work that Roger has done, not only for his career as a teacher, but really he and his wife, late wife, Claudette, really have kept the civic education effort and with people together, sort of body and soul in recent years here in Massachusetts. So really grateful for that, Roger. So I'm going to ask the other panelists to begin to migrate themselves in, and while they do that, I just want to say something about We the People, because you heard a little bit about it in my introductory remarks, and I think you're going to find it reflected in the panel that we have here. So all these teachers are We the People teachers, and one of the things that I found really great about it is that unlike so much in education policy and so many efforts, We the People, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's been so successful, is it's really teacher driven, and they're the ones who do much of the work and inspire the kids and really make it happen. And of course, that's true of a lot of people who run it, and that is pretty unique. So what I'm going to ask each one of the panelists to do is just give just a couple of comments about Roger's presentation, or how they do their work, or the topic, for about 3 to 4 minutes each. And we'll begin with Shane.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So Roger gave you kind of a very quick overview of some of the fundamentals of civic education in the fundamentals of the We the People program, which is the primary tool that I use in my classroom and we use at our school to teach civics and to teach civic education. And what you probably saw a little bit was that it begins with political philosophy. In my class, that means it begins with reading the primary source documents of Aristotle. We read Polybius, we read natural rights philosophers, we read Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Moving into the history of the creation of the United States government, the implementation of the Constitution, how it's changed over time. And all along, the idea is to develop some foundational understandings of the principles and structure of American government, so that students can use those tools and those lenses throughout the year to critically analyze historical events, current events, and public policy. And it gives them it puts them in the role of the sort of the person whose job it is to continue to make and support our government, right? It doesn't put them in the role of a consumer of knowledge or just a consumer of information, the way that is sometimes typical in schools. It puts them in the position of a maker, a creator, somebody who's going to be asked to have an opinion about these things and needs the skills and the tools to have those opinions. So, we ask them to, and I'm sure Natalie and Sam will echo this, we ask them to critique structures and practices of government. We ask them what they would like to see and why. We ask them to consider how any changes they suggest might impact some of these fundamental principles, like the rule of law, democracy, human equality, and to consider their ideas about what they'd like to see in government against these foundational principles and structures that we've built the course from. And as I mentioned, this again allows them to see themselves as active participants. It creates a sense of civic responsibility, civic efficacy. I think additionally, one of the things that I think it's important for civics teachers to do, and we do here, is to try to expose students directly to government officials, to invite elected officials to our classrooms, to go to the state legislature. We're lucky we're in a state capital, and we can do that a little bit more easily, but to go to state courts. We run mock elections at our schools so that students are actually participating, getting practice at participating in democracy. I've had students do political participation projects where many of them work as student elections assistants, actually work at polls, or may choose to volunteer for a campaign. So all of these pieces kind of work together to engage students and to help create knowledgeable, thoughtful, contributing citizens through civic education. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shane. And Natalie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Natalie O'Brien. As I was introduced before, I'm a teacher at North Smithfield in Rhode Island. And Roger did a great job just kind of encapsulating like the main premise that I think if we're interested and passionate about teaching civics that we really want to bring across in our classrooms. And the three of us here today obviously utilize the We the People curriculum as a tool to kind of bring this to life for our students. And I loved how at the end, Roger really clarified that, you know, teaching about this isn't just about teaching or instructing about the men at the time. It's about really focusing on those principles, right, that they founded and the institutions that have resulted from the Constitution. And then it kind of falls on us to like grapple with these issues today. So just that foundation of first understanding the philosophical foundations of the Constitution, what our founders were thinking about, what their reflections involved, and obviously incredibly well-read individuals. And I think that's important for our students to know that you don't get the answer the first time you Google something, right? You need to look in a lot of different places. And that, you know, the creation of our government was a lot of reflection on past governments, on their own experiences, on philosophy, and then kind of where we go from there. And students have to like take positions or at least learn and reflect on some really hard choices that were made historically and that have to be made today in order for our republic to survive. And education is really just the key to that, right? Like the role of the citizen cannot be overstated, and you do need the content knowledge first, but like the classroom is a great place for the students to feel comfortable to build on and, you know, converse about what it means to them and what it means to our republic. So thank you for having me here, and I'm excited to talk about civics education.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And Sam.
So one thing that I think Roger's presentation did a really good job of bringing out is that there's a tremendous amount of tension among the various different abstract ideas that are part of the constitutional framing. And one of the things that the We the People curriculum asks the students to learn to sit with, which is very difficult, is that there is tension, that it's about the degree of republicanism, liberalism, constitutionalism, and how those things exist in a balance with one another. You can never perfectly satisfy any of them. It really asks the students, as Roger showed the framers trying to do, to figure out which values they want to emphasize when, and then to explain when those values are being fulfilled and how. And that really demands them deliberating among themselves, doing some pretty deep research in ways that no other curriculum, I teach a lot of other AP courses, and no other curriculum requires the kind of research that the We the People curriculum asks students to do on their own. And so I think that's a crucial point from Roger's presentation that I'd want to bring out. I also would highlight that it's a modular curriculum, which is a really important thing about the We the People curriculum. You can teach it as your entire government class, but I often pull, a unit for my AP US history class and another unit or two for my AP US government class, and I only use the whole curriculum as the basis for my dedicated We the People class. And that's a valuable part of a good civics education tool, is it can adapt to the classroom circumstances that we as teachers happen to face in terms of calendars and timing and external demands. And I found it very, very valuable in that way, especially the units on the institutions for AP government and the ways in which checks and balances work with one another. And I also want to echo what Shane was saying about the usefulness of the way that We the People curriculum allows you to bring in state and local government to make connections, because it begins with abstract concepts and political theory. You can then extend those concepts into the way that students get involved in local government. And like her, I'm in a state capitol here in Richmond, Virginia, and it allows us to take the students to the state capitol or bring officials to us, and the students, because of the way that We the People curriculum helps them to shape their inquiries, are much more receptive to those sorts of political figures, and those sorts of political figures enjoy coming and being part of our classroom discussions a great deal more than I think they would if this were a more cut and dried sort of a class curriculum. So I think those are all important ways in which the We the People curriculum helps to really liven up and make more effective almost any civics or history teaching experience.
Thanks so much, Sam. So I've got a series of follow-up questions, and I'm going to begin with Shane. So both you and Natalie talked about, and you're certainly an academic dean. So can you just tell us a little bit about your own academic background and how you got interested in this work, as well as how you first became familiar with We the People?
Sure. So I have an undergraduate degree in history from Amherst College, and then ended up wanting to become a teacher. And so sought out a master's in teaching program, which brought me to North Carolina. And I actually used the We the People program in high school way back. And my teacher actually didn't fully understand the way the competition worked. So I always joke with my students, there's a part of the competition that involves a prepared statement that students spend a lot of time researching, and then they, in the model of a simulated congressional hearing, they answer follow-up questions that they haven't heard before. My teacher didn't understand the prepared statement part, so we went to a competition and treated it all like follow-up questions. But using the curriculum and was really, really influenced me a great deal in terms of the way that the value I thought I gained from that experience in high school, and how much I wanted to bring it to my own teaching. And so I've been teaching the We the People curriculum as a teacher on and off since the year 2000, when I first attended a summer institute actually in Boston at BU with Roger, and learned these were institutes that the Center for Civic Education supported, where we could learn how to teach the program. And so since then, I've been teaching the material on and off.
Great. So Natalie, over the last year or so, you and two co-authors have been drafting a 500-page grades 5, 8, and 11 civics greatest hits curriculum for Pioneer that we ultimately want to put online. Can you give us sort of a sneak preview, or talk a little bit about how teaching We the People to high school freshmen? And you're unique in the sense that your classes are always comprised of freshmen at the Nationals, and how that work with We the People influenced our project.
Sure. Very similar to Shane, actually. I first got introduced to the We the People curriculum in 2002. I went to a workshop, definitely changed my understanding of civics, right? And increased my knowledge base exponentially. And then I brought it back to my classroom, and it really revolutionized what I try to do every year in my classes. And in Rhode Island, civics is not a required class, but my district's been doing it for about 20 years, and it just so happens that it falls in freshman year. So when I had all this knowledge and all this passion and excitement, I brought it to the students that I was teaching. And it really is amazing how much young people, with the supports and good resources, like how much they can really learn and grow, and how much they can embrace civics, because it's really relatable to them. Like, students are often asking, how will this help me in the long run? Why does this matter? And sometimes they struggle to see a connection. But when you teach about civics, I think that they can turn on the news or go home and they hear parents or adults talking about it, and it really makes them feel empowered. And if you can do that with kids who are 14, then imagine what you can do with the right resources and the right supports and teachers who are properly trained or have good info, what you could do kind of across all of the ages. So something that three of us have been working on now with the Pioneer Institute is to create a curriculum based on the preamble. where you kind of take these main ideals, right, that I guess are kind of, the introduction of what the structures are in the Constitution, and how could you have these come alive for students in 5th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. And it's really wonderful because you start with like this set of ideals that are important for young people to understand, and then we're trying to find a way where we can reach the students where they are and then help them grow through the use of engaging activities, role plays, mock trials. We're using primary sources, right? Like a 5th grader with a smaller document can still access and have really meaningful conversations. So that's what we've been working on. And it's nice to have students think about, who were we the people, who are we the people, where do we fit in, how do you create a more perfect union? Like, these are ideas that obviously are historical, but students can also connect with.
Thanks so much. So Sam, your high school teams have won many We the People state and national championships. Could you talk a little bit about what it's like teaching civics through We the People, the role that teachers play in driving We the People, and how the students and family respond to the program?
I'll sort of take the question back to front. Families respond to this program really exceptionally strongly. I have a lot more parents who are now donors to our school's foundation in proportion to the We the People program than any other program that this school has ever run, because it creates memories, whether they win or not. And we've had a few teams over the years win, but the vast majority haven't. So regardless, it's a powerful memory for the families and the students who have conversations about national politics, local politics, values. So it really creates investment among the community. How do the students respond? And they feel a great degree of freedom. They are given these exceptionally open-ended prompts that invoke, is the president just too powerful? Or do we not have enough civic virtue in society today? And give me some examples. And they just run with this stuff. And if you give them the proper resources, then they experience a degree of intellectual growth that would be impossible to accomplish with a more prescriptive curriculum that was more focused on specific and individual factual achievements. So the students tend to respond by taking the mile you give them and running a marathon. And it's really impressive to see. How do the teachers across the country do this? Well, one, it's a great professional network. You get to meet and to know people in your state at the state competition. If you go to the national competition, at the national competition, through the Center for Civic Education itself, which offers a variety of ways for you to interact with other teachers throughout the country that work on the We the People program. And that civics education network is really valuable because civics is sometimes, it feels a little bit like a backwater in education. And knowing that there are other people out there just as dedicated and energetic as you are is a real morale boost to you as a teacher to get to see other people just so dedicated. The other thing that I think is really useful as a teacher is that it's not the same year to year. A lot of teaching feels really Sisyphean, that you're rolling the same boulder every year. And We the People, it's a different set of questions that your students work with each year. They're all based on the We the People curriculum. They all come from the same fundamental textbook and set of ideas, but at least parts of it are a little bit different. And you're getting to edit new papers and do new practice rounds and investigate new topics and read a new treatise you hadn't read in 5 or 6 years to help the students with it. It helps keep me alive a little bit as a teacher in ways that I don't think I would be without this program. And that's really valuable. I think any teacher in the audience knows that it's great to have an outlet like that, especially when it's one that's also productive to the students. Finally, I do want to say that it's not my magic here. I'm lucky enough to teach at a school that is a regional magnet school for students who have an interest in international studies, government, and things like that. So I don't want it to sound like I'm some kind of genius at teaching We the People. The other two folks here with me are more experienced and have a lot more to say about implementing the curriculum in some ways.
Thank you. So, Shane, could you talk a little about any relationship you sort of seeing between the ongoing civic unrest and educational trends and the way in which we're teaching or not teaching history and civics in schools? And how does the We the People curriculum sort of help navigate this landscape? It's impressive that it doesn't get pulled into partisanship or a lot of these sort of food fights. And you just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that the reason that it functions that way is because it's really a curriculum of questions. It's a curriculum of principles and structures, and then even the textbook itself. If you were to, as a new teacher picking this material up, to just start with the textbook, I mean, it's a textbook of questions. It forces students to think about the ways in which are the structures functioning well? You've learned about these principles, in what ways does separation of powers help with the rule of law, right? How do these principles interact with one another? It's not prescribing answers. And so at a time when there seems to be a lot of unrest around what answers we should be giving students, this curriculum doesn't try to give students answers. It teaches them that there are lots of great questions and they can think about them in their own way. I see that in my students when they end the year, that when you ask them what did they gain from the year, they'll tell you they feel like they have the knowledge to participate. They feel like they have a sense of confidence in their abilities to express their own opinions in ways, and back that up by historical and contemporary evidence. The curriculum itself is a tool for teaching civil discourse, right? It sets up in your classroom the kind of environment where there's going to be differences of opinion, and it provides you a frame for engaging in that with those differences. So I guess I think that that open-endedness can make people sometimes uncomfortable, right? It's hard as a teacher to be like, I don't have all the answers, but that's the basis of this. And in a lot of ways, I think it's very freeing, because it does take you out of whatever the current partisan struggles over education might be in the moment, and instead says, I'm going to teach my students the ways in which they can answer these questions with their own beliefs and understandings based on information.
Great. So Natalie, I kind of alluded to it in giving Roger credit for holding things together here in Massachusetts. I think sometimes people assume in New England states that there's tons of support for civics. Could you just talk a little bit about Rhode Island, your own state, and some of the struggles that there are keeping civics on the table, keeping it as a central topic of in front of legislators or policymakers, and talk a little bit about sort of those ups and downs in Rhode Island the last couple of years.
Yeah, so there have certainly been a lot of struggles in Rhode Island regarding civics education. So it was never a state priority. And we got a report card a couple of years ago where it showed that we were doing terribly. North Smithfield, I do think, and a couple other districts have required it, but there's a huge disparity rather between the different school districts and the type of education that students are receiving. So again, to go off of what Sam was saying, like a nice thing about the We the People program is that it does involve collaboration, right? So students work together and then communities work together. And through the congressional hearing process, we've had people throughout the state, come in to engage in these hearings. And I do think it's brought attention to some key lawmakers about what they might like to see be more uniform throughout the state, right? You shouldn't be lucky based on your zip code that you're getting the civics education that you need. So I think people were really talking about it at the state level. In 2018, there were actually 14 students in Rhode Island in Providence who sued. They sued that they were being denied the proper civics education, and they actually sued under the 14th Amendment and in federal court rather than tackling it as a state issue. And it was cool because my students had found out about this case through research, doing other things, preparing for either states or nationals. But so this obviously brought the topic to light. And then finally in 2001, we passed the Civic Literacy Act. which was kind of modeled after Massachusetts, where now every student will have to take a civics class or show some type of competency in civics in order to be able to graduate high school. And as a result of the lawsuit, a civics task force was created in Rhode Island, where a series of stakeholders were put together to devise a curriculum, because the case never went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So rather than fighting that battle in Rhode Island, I think it was, hey, let's handle it here. And there were really meaningful conversations in the task force. I was a member about, does civics need to be its own class? Can it be embedded in a U.S. history class? What type of project would you like students to complete to prove competency? What type of civics project would be required that would get students to interact with local and state officials to try to make a difference? So finally, we're having really great conversations. And obviously, I'm a proponent and supporter of the We the People program, and I wish that every district here in Rhode Island would implement it. But I think the best that we are hoping to accomplish is that students end up with the basic skills and dispositions and content knowledge that they need to be successful.
Great, thanks. So Sam, your state of Virginia not only includes, many of the founders' homes, but Civil War battlefields, and from my point of view, generally does a terrific job in supporting civics and history instruction. What are the lessons that other states can learn from Virginia about making civics and history sort of central to the K-12 experience?
So two halves to that question, one about Virginia in general and one about founders' homes and sites and things. So I'll look at them separately. We do require it as a graduation required class. You can't leave high school without having taken a government and civics class. Sometimes it's a half year, sometimes it's a year, and that really helps to get broad buy-in. As a state, more generally, we have since 2011 had a state government created civics commission with both legislative members and non-legislative members who are appointed for 2-year rotating terms. And one of the things that state civics commission does very successfully is bring together stakeholders and resource groups from across the curriculum or from across the state. So you'll have folks from the universities, from the political science departments, politics and legal departments in the universities. You'll have people from the school districts, from the legislature, and they have a semi-annual, hopefully annual again soon, now that we're recovering from the coronavirus disruptions, Civics Education Summit. And so having a formal organization through which to continue to propagate new resources and to coordinate the different groups that are active in civic education in the state of Virginia is something that we do very successfully, in addition to having a sort of curricular requirement at the high school level for students to be part of. As far as the founders' homes and the historic sites, they are really, really dynamic and effective at keeping themselves up to date. So 3 that I'd point to are James Madison's home of Montpelier, the site of Fort Monroe down near Hampton Roads, and the Civil War Center of Tredegar Ironworks here in Richmond, all of which have taken what could have been pretty stodgy museum experiences and transformed them into contemporary, dynamic, interesting, community-facing places that engage with, for example, in the case of James Madison's home, Montpelier, the enslaved community around it, the immediately nearby town of Orange, to tell this really broad constitutional story that students can engage with even if their eyes glaze over when they're learning about which books Madison read while standing in his library. Now, my eyes don't glaze over about that, but this gives students a lot of ways to engage with these historic sites because the historic sites themselves are extremely interested in paying attention to the most recent work in historiography and in public engagement and things like that. So that's sort of the 2 halves of that question, and how I think Virginia, at least, has made some progress at addressing them.
Great. So we're closing in towards the end of the webinar, but I wanted to have one sort of final shared questions that maybe all of you folks could answer. And we'll start with Shane. But What is the single most rewarding aspect of how and what you teach your students in civic education? And if you were in a room filled with teachers of civics and government, what would your message be to them?
So I was talking with my students yesterday about the fact that I was going to be on this panel and asking them sort of, what did you gain from the class? It's the end of the year. It was a great question to end with. And the extent to which they talked about the fact that they feel ready to engage with public policy as citizens. They feel ready to be educated voters. They really feel prepared to participate in political campaigns and to weigh in on heavy issues is the reward. And I would encourage teachers to the reason to adopt this curriculum is because it creates citizens, and that is something we desperately need, is people who are engaged, who understand, who have the knowledge, and then are engaged with democracy.
Natalie?
I guess I would talk about like empowerment and passion. Like, I think as a civics teacher, I feel a tremendous opportunity, right, to educate young people to fulfill a super important role in society. And I think students can take that passion and then they give it back to you, right? So it's like this mutually beneficial relationship where I'm feeding off of their energy and their excitement, and vice versa. And I guess what I love most is when students are no longer in your class and you get an email about something that happened in the news, or they have a question, or like I teach freshmen. So for the next 3 years, they'll stop by and say, hey, can I be a judge this year in the congressional hearings? Or, so that engagement doesn't stop at the end of the year, right? And I think that's the whole point. Like, you don't just say, check, now I know everything. Now I'm a great citizen. I have the skills. Like, it's a process, and it's nice to see that over time.
Thank you. And Samuel?
Yeah, I'd like to echo one more time this notion of empowerment, that the We the People curriculum in particular, and civics education in general, convinces students that they have a role to play, that they are going to be part of shaping the future of the country, whether in a small way through voting or in a huge way through volunteering and becoming an activist. It really gives them energy and efficacy and the desire to be part of the ongoing civic conversation, because they know that they can do something meaningful to change that civic conversation and to weigh in on it, that no other program, like, no hate on the College Board, but that AP government simply doesn't do. So I think that's really crucial. And just on a personal level, I enjoy the fact that because We the People is so teacher driven, it creates personal relationships between you and the students that other curricula do not. At this point, I'll go up to DC every summer or every other summer, and my many students who've ended up there in internships, because we're pretty close to DC, this happens to me, who ended up there in internships in Congress or in agencies and things like that, we'll all do a little get together. I've done this a few times now. And so you really end up with many, many years long, maybe even decades long at this point, relationships with these students. They come back to you and they tell you what they're up to. One of them dedicated their senior thesis to me. It really creates a fulfilling, long-term relationship with the students for you as a teacher, because it's teacher-driven.
Great. Well, we've come to the end, but I want to thank Roger, Shane, Natalie, and Sam, and really are grateful for your work, your careers, the dedication that you have, not only your schools, but also to the larger work of We the People. And I want to thank the audience too. Really appreciate people's time today. This is obviously a very important topic. It's central really to our democracy and our way of life. And I feel really fortunate to have been able to judge We the People for many years. And we're really happy to be able to help present these teachers, excellent teachers, on a topic that matters so much. So thank you again, and really appreciate it.